whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
Imagine you are standing in modern London, where buses sigh at the curb and the pavement carries 1,000 footsteps at once. The air smells like damp stone and coffee, and the river is not far away. You can hear a low, constant city hum that feels timeless, but it is not. One turn, one gate, one heavy door, and the sound changes. The noise thins out. Your own steps begin to sound louder than you expect. The light becomes colder, as if it has been filtered through centuries. Westminster Abbey does that to people. Even if you have seen it in photographs, the first time you stand inside, your body reacts before your mind can explain why. The ceiling is too high for ordinary life. The stone is too patient. Names are everywhere, carved into walls, laid into floors, rising on monuments like waves turned into architecture. It is a building that remembers on purpose. If you enjoy this kind of slow, human history, the kind that turns places into stories you can almost touch, consider subscribing now, because we are going to take a long walk through a world that is both strange and familiar. In the South Transept, in a corner that is not really a corner anymore because it has grown beyond its own boundaries, there is a cluster of graves and memorials to writers. People call it Poets' Corner. It feels like the nation decided that words matter enough to be kept close to the altar. But the origin is not sentimental. It starts with a practical decision. Geoffrey Chaucer, who died in 1400, was buried here, not because the country had already voted him the father of English poetry, but because he worked nearby, served the crown, and lived close to the Abbey precinct. The Abbey's own records still explain it in that plain way. Office, proximity, royal favor, and the ordinary logic of burial that becomes extraordinary only later. A tomb placed for convenience becomes a shrine for literature. Centuries later, other writers gather around him, and a tradition grows like ivy, one name after another, until the stone itself begins to read like a national bookshelf. Chaucer's most famous work, the Canterbury Tales, is not a tidy moral lesson or a single heroic legend. It is a noisy crowd on the road. It is quarrels and jokes and arguments and ordinary desires. It is the medieval world talking in 100 voices, sometimes pious, sometimes greedy, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel. Scholars look at those voices the way archaeologists look at a broken pot, not because it is perfect, but because it carries fingerprints. One of those voices is the wife of Bath, a woman who refuses to stay inside the neat categories medieval moralists preferred. Another is the plowman, whose honesty is described as if it is a kind of nobility. You meet priests and merchants, a miller who boasts too loudly, a reeve who knows everyone's debts, a knight whose honor is praised and questioned at the same time. Chaucer is not giving you a postcard of the Middle Ages, he is giving you a crowd. And that crowd is where we begin, because it reminds us of the first truth about medieval life. There was no single medieval experience. The period stretches across centuries. It spans islands and continents. It includes kings and beggars, monks and sailors, skilled artisans, and land-bound farmers. What we can do is step closer to the core patterns that shape most lives: faith, work, marriage, and death. Not as separate topics, but as braided strands. Because to a medieval person, they were never fully separate. Start with faith, not because everyone was equally devout, but because faith organized time itself. Medieval Europe did not live by a calendar of productivity. It lived by a calendar of meaning. The year turned around, feast days and fast days. Bells marked hours. The church year told you when to celebrate, when to abstain, when to remember the dead, when to prepare for resurrection. Even if you doubted, even if you sinned and laughed about it, the structure of life still moved to that rhythm. Imagine a village morning. The houses are small, and smoke curls from a hole in the roof. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of wood and animals. Because animals are not far away, warmth is precious, light is precious. The day begins early because the day is short in winter and long in summer, and work follows the sun more than it follows a clock. A child wakes on straw. A mother hears the first sounds of movement in the yard. A man checks the sky because weather is not a background detail, it is a verdict. If the rain comes at the wrong time, hunger follows. If the frost stays too long, the seed fails. If the summer is wet and cold, the grain rots. The earth does not negotiate. Now add the social structure. In many places, especially in the classic feudal countryside of Western Europe, Land is divided into manors, and people are divided by rights and obligations. Some are free tenants, some are cotters with small plots, and some are serfs, bound to a hereditary holding and to the will of a lord in ways that are not the same as slavery but are still heavy. A serf is not simply owned as a person, yet cannot simply leave the land as if life were a personal project. The difference matters, but so does the constraint. Work begins in the fields, and field work is not romantic. It is repetitive, seasonal, and exhausting. The tools are simple: wooden plows with iron tips, sickles, spades, flails. Hands blister, backs ache. The work is communal because the open field system and the sheer scale of labor make isolation impossible. When one family harvests, they are surrounded by others doing the same, because the village survives together or fails together. The manor court matters. The Lord Steward matters. The reeve, often chosen from among the villagers, matters because he is the one who must balance community survival with the demands above them. Rent can be paid in money, but often it is paid in labor. Days owed to the Lord's demesne fields, extra work at harvest, obligations that show up like a tax on time. There are also dues that feel small until they pile up. A hen at Easter, grain at Michaelmas, fees for using the Lord's miller oven, and fines for breaking rules that may seem petty until you realize they are tools of order. In a good year, there is bread, pottage, maybe cheese, maybe a bit of meat on special days. In a bad year, the diet narrows until it becomes survival math. Grain is stored, but storage is vulnerable. Rats, damp, fire, theft, and simple miscalculation can turn a household from stable to desperate in a season. Now look upward, to the noble household, and you find a different kind of insecurity. Nobles have more food, more space, more clothing, and more power, but they also live inside a world of status and obligation that can be lethal. A noble's identity is tied to land, lineage, and loyalty. Feuds can last generations. Alliances are built by marriage, reinforced by oaths, tested by war. The hall is a place of hospitality and display. Who sits where matters. Who speaks first matters. Who brings the best gifts matters. The noble household runs on service. Servants sleep near kitchens, corridors, and stables. The smell of horses mixes with the smell of cooking fat and smoke. Linen is washed and repaired. Armor is maintained. Weapons are kept close. Even in peacetime, violence is never far away, because medieval politics is not a distant news event. It is embodied in men with swords who are also cousins and rivals. If you want to understand medieval work, you cannot stay only in the countryside. You have to enter the towns, because by around the year 1000 and onward, across many parts of Europe, towns begin to expand in number and influence. Trade increases. Markets become more regular. Money moves more often. People travel more than the stereotype suggests, especially merchants, pilgrims, clerics, and skilled workers. A medieval town is a dense knot of life. Streets are narrow, houses lean over the road, workshops open onto the street because light is scarce and space is expensive. The smell is intense: smoke, leather, wool, sweat, beer, refuse. In summer, heat traps odors. In winter, damp turns everything into a slow rot. Here, the rhythm of work changes. Instead of seasonal plowing and harvesting, you have repetitive craft. Instead of the village common, you have the guild hall. Guilds are not just labor unions. They are training systems, quality control systems, social clubs, religious fraternities, and political forces. Apprentices live in a master's household. They learn by watching and by doing. They sweep floors, carry water, tend fires, and gradually earn the right to touch the work that pays. Then comes the journeyman stage, where a worker travels or works for wages, gathering experience, saving money, and hoping for advancement. To become a master, you need more than skill. You need proof. Proof of competence, proof of resources, proof of reputation. In some places, you also need connections. And often, the proof takes the form of a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrates what your hands can do. Because in a world without standardized diplomas, the object itself is the credential. In the market, everything has its place. Bread has rules: weight, price, quality. Beer has rules. Cloth has rules. Many of these rules are enforced because disorder threatens the city's stability, but they also serve the interests of established masters, who do not want competition from outsiders. Guilds can protect quality and exploit newcomers at the same time. Medieval life is full of that duality. Walk through York, and you can still find a street that carries this old economy in its bones. The Shambles is famous today for how picturesque it looks, with timber buildings pressed close together. But the name itself comes from meat. It refers to butcher stalls and meat shelves, to benches where flesh was displayed. The architecture, the shade, the narrowness, even the channels that once carried waste were part of a working system. Keep the meat cooler, keep it out of harsh sunlight, move people through a market where food was exposed to air, flies, and time. And time matters. Freshness is not an aesthetic preference. It is the line between dinner and illness. In a medieval town, sanitation is not a solved problem. Water is carried, waste is dumped, animals roam. Rivers are used for washing and for disposal. People know that foul air is dangerous, even if they explain it through miasma rather than microbes. They build latrines. They pass ordinances. They try to keep slaughter away from wells, but the density of life keeps fighting back. Now bring faith back in, because even in the town, even in the workshop, the church remains present. Guilds have patron saints. They maintain altars. They sponsor processions. They pay for candles. They bury their members. In a world where death is common, institutions that promise memory and meaning become powerful. Death is everywhere in medieval life, but it is not always dramatic. Much of it is quiet. A child who never reaches the age of 5. An old man whose lungs fail in winter. A woman who survives childbirth 3 times and then dies on the 4th. A laborer who falls from a roof. A fisherman who does not return from the water. A fever that burns through a household and then moves on. It is easy to say, people died young, and stop there. But medieval mortality is not a single number. Life expectancy at birth in many pre-modern contexts is pulled downward by the brutal fact that many infants die and many children die. That does not mean everyone died at 30. It means the average is weighted by graves that never became adults. If you survived childhood, you could live into your 50s, 60s, sometimes beyond. But survival was never guaranteed, and everyone knew it. This knowledge changes how you understand medieval marriage. Marriage is not just romance, it is risk management. It is inheritance planning. It is alliance building. It is labor organization. It is also, for many individuals, a genuine attachment that grows out of proximity, shared hardship, and ordinary affection. But the institution is shaped by law, and in medieval Europe, especially in the Latin West, marriage law is deeply influenced by canon law. Consent matters. That is one of the great turning points in medieval Christian marriage. The idea that a valid marriage requires the consent of the two people, not only the arrangement of families. That does not mean families stop arranging matches. They do. It does not mean young people are free in the modern sense. They are not. But it does mean that marriage can become a legal battlefield where individuals, especially women in some cases, can appeal to the church courts with claims of consent, coercion, pre-contracts, and legitimacy. The canonical minimum age for marriage is shockingly low by modern standards, around 12 for girls and 14 for boys in many church law discussions. In practice, actual marriage ages vary by region, class, and economic reality. Peasant couples often marry later than the minimum, because starting a household requires resources. Noble families may marry earlier for alliance reasons. But the legal threshold reveals something about the medieval imagination of adulthood. It arrives early, because life does not wait. A wedding is both a public ritual and a private transition. The church wants the marriage blessed, recorded, witnessed. The community wants to know who belongs to whom, because that affects property, support, and responsibility. In many places, there are negotiations over dowry, the resources the bride's family brings, and over dower or widow's provision, the resources that should protect a woman if her husband dies. These arrangements matter because widowhood is common, and a widow's survival can depend on whether she has a claim to land, goods, or income. Inside marriage, labor is shared and divided. A peasant household is an economic unit. Men plow and harvest, but women also work in the fields, tend animals, manage dairy, spin, brew, bake, and keep the household alive. In towns, women can participate in craft work, sometimes officially, sometimes informally, sometimes as widows who inherit a workshop and run it. The boundary between men's work and women's work exists, but it is not a wall. It is more like a shifting fence. And then there is childbirth. Here, medieval life shows its hardest edge. Pregnancy is common, contraception is limited and unreliable, though knowledge exists. Children are needed for labor and for survival, but each birth carries risk. The mother faces hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, and complications no one can treat effectively. The infant faces exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Families build emotional strategies for this reality. They baptize quickly, they name children after saints. They lean on community support. They pray, not as a decorative habit, but as a psychological necessity. Even in later pre-industrial England, centuries after the medieval period, historians studying parish records find maternal mortality around 1% per birth on average, a reminder of how dangerous the weeks after delivery could be. Medieval conditions were not safer. That risk sits silently behind every story of family and continuity. So how do people cope with the constant nearness of death? Part of the answer is ritual. The medieval church offers a language for suffering and a map for the afterlife. Confession, penance, last rites, prayers for the dead, masses, candles, saints' intercession, pilgrimage. These are not side activities. They are technologies of meaning. But another part of the answer is community. In village life, you cannot vanish without consequences. People notice. Neighbors help with harvest if a household is struck by illness. Women assist women in childbirth. Guilds support members in sickness. Confraternities sponsor funerals and prayers. The social web is not always kind, but it is thick. And then, sometimes, the web is torn apart. In the early 14th century, Europe suffers the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a crisis driven by relentless rains, crop failures, and hunger that weakens bodies and erodes resilience. Malnutrition does not only kill directly, it makes people vulnerable to everything else. It also creates social strain, theft, migration, conflict, desperation. A generation later, the Black Death arrives. Between 1347 and 1351, plague tears through Europe with a violence that is almost impossible to describe without sounding exaggerated. In many regions, a third of the population dies, and in some places, the losses are higher. The disease travels along trade routes, through ports and roads, and it moves faster than the cultural explanations can keep up. Imagine what that means on the ground. You are in a town where the bell tolls again and again until it feels like the sound will never stop. You are in a village where the strongest man is buried next to the weakest child, and no one has energy left to separate tragedy into categories. You are watching wagons carry bodies. You are watching priests fall sick. You are watching social rules bend under the weight of survival. You are hearing rumors, poisoned wells, divine punishment, strange omens. You are seeing people flee and others lock their doors. And yet life continues afterward. That is another medieval truth. Catastrophe does not end the world, it reshapes it. Labor becomes scarce. Wages rise in some places. Serfdom changes in some regions as landlords struggle to hold on to workers. Towns adapt. New religious movements emerge. Old certainties are questioned and defended, sometimes violently. For ordinary people, the experience of death remains a daily pressure. Even when the great waves of plague recede, the expectation that you might lose a child, a spouse, a friend, is part of the background of life, like weather. This does not mean medieval people were numb. Letters, wills, and art show grief, tenderness, fear, and longing. It means they built cultural tools to live with grief without collapsing. One of those tools is memory. Look again at Westminster Abbey. The stone is a statement, we remember. But medieval memory is not only national or elite, it is also local. A parish church with worn floor tiles, a painted screen showing saints, a small brass plaque, a name in a prayer list, a candle lit for a soul, a guild's funeral banner, a widow's donation, a father's bequest for a mass. If you step into a medieval parish church, you can feel how the living and the dead are meant to share space. The dead are not kept outside the village. They are buried near the church, sometimes inside it if status allows. Graves are walked over. Names are repeated. The boundary between present and past is thinner than we are used to. Now return to marriage, because death and marriage are linked by property. When a husband dies, who inherits? When a wife dies, what happens to her dowry? When children die, who holds the land? These questions are not abstract. They are the difference between stability and ruin. And this is why medieval families care so much about legitimacy, about contracts, about witnesses, about church recognition. For nobles, the stakes are higher, and so are the performances. Marriage joins houses. It can end wars or start them. It can be used to claim thrones. It can produce heirs or produce crises. A noblewoman can be both a political tool and a political actor, depending on circumstances. A nobleman's honor is bound up in lineage, and lineage is bound up in female fertility and survival. The body becomes political. For peasants, marriage is tied to the holding. On some manors, a serf needs the lord's permission to marry and may pay a fee. That fee is not merely economic, it is a reminder of dependency. In other places, the community has more autonomy. Medieval Europe is patchwork. In towns, marriage intersects with craft. A master's household includes apprentices. A wife may supervise food, finances, and labor. A widow may inherit a workshop, and because she has the recognized status of master's widow, she may continue the trade. But she may also face pressure to remarry, or competition from other masters who want her resources. Agency and vulnerability sit together, and all of this happens under the shadow of the church's moral teaching. Sex is permitted in marriage, condemned outside it, but reality is messier. People break rules. They make jokes about breaking rules. They confess and break them again. Brothels exist in towns. Illegitimate children exist. Clergy sometimes fail their own standards. The medieval world is not a museum of purity. It is a society of humans. So what does an ordinary day feel like? Not in the abstract, but in the body. It feels cold more often than you want. It feels damp. It feels like your hands are always doing something. It feels like your stomach is never quite sure whether it will be full tomorrow. It feels like your back learns pain early. It feels like clothing is heavier and rougher. It feels like sleep is lighter because you share space with family, animals, and noise. It also feels communal. You do not eat alone. You do not work alone. You do not celebrate alone. Festivals exist. Music exists. Dancing exists. Ale exists. Storytelling exists. Saints' days are excuses for gathering. Weddings are loud. Funerals are communal. Children play. Teenagers flirt. Adults laugh. Old people advise. The medieval world contains joy, and it contains it in ordinary forms. When people talk about the Middle Ages as if it is a single mood, they miss this complexity. They miss how much skill existed in craft. They miss the intelligence of agricultural practice. They miss the social negotiations required to keep a village from tearing itself apart. They miss the emotional strategies that allowed people to love children even when death was common, to make plans even when the future was uncertain, to build cathedrals even when the ground under them was always moving. Now, because we began in Poets' Corner, it is worth returning to the idea of storytelling as evidence. Chaucer's Pilgrims are fictional, but they are not random. They reflect real tensions between classes, between church ideals and human behavior, between gender expectations and lived experience, between the moral language of the time and the humor that undermines it. The Wife of Bath boasts, argues, manipulates scripture, and insists that experience matters as much as authority. Whether you see her as a comic stereotype, a proto-feminist voice, or a complex blend of both, she tells you that medieval women could be imagined as forceful, strategic, and loud. That matters, because modern caricatures often erase medieval women into silence. The Plowman, praised for honest labor, tells you that the moral imagination of the time could honor work, even if the social structure exploited workers. The Pardoner, selling spiritual goods, tells you that corruption and cynicism were recognized, mocked, and endured. The tales are not a window you can trust completely, but they are a mirror of anxieties. And then there are the physical sources: manor records, guild regulations, church court cases, wills, tax lists, archaeology. When you put them together, a picture emerges that is less cinematic but more persuasive. A world built on relationships, obligations, and beliefs that made sense inside the risks people faced. One of the hardest things to carry into the present is the medieval relationship with uncertainty. Today, many of us live with systems that promise predictability: insurance, medicine, refrigeration, central heating, social safety nets. instant communication. Medieval people lived closer to chance. A storm could change your year. A lord's decision could change your household. A disease could arrive in a merchant's pack. A pregnancy could become a death sentence. A war could move across your region because a distant alliance snapped. That does not mean medieval people were passive. They negotiated, they adapted, they sued in court, they ran away, they changed trades. They joined religious movements. They migrated to towns. They used every tool available: communal support, religious practice, practical knowledge, and sometimes violence. If you want one image to hold all of this, imagine a narrow street at dawn. Shops are shuttered. A butcher's stall is being prepared. A baker's fire is already lit. A woman carries water. A child runs past and is scolded. A bell rings for morning prayer. A cartwheel squeaks. A dog sniffs at refuse. Somewhere inside a house, a mother wakes with the dull ache of pregnancy and does not know whether her next birth will end in laughter or mourning. The medieval world is not a costume drama. It is a set of lives lived close to necessity. And the reason the stones of places like Westminster Abbey still speak is not only because kings are buried there. It is because the lives around those kings shaped language, law, work, and memory in ways that still echo. Before we leave, take one more slow walk through Poet's Corner in your imagination. Remember what the abbey itself says about its origin. It began because a man worked nearby and he was buried close to his workplace. History often starts like that, with something practical. Meaning comes later, added by generations who decide that the past deserves a permanent place. When you step back out into modern London, the buses return, the crowds return, the screens glow, and the city's pace tries to pull you forward. But if you carry the medieval world with you for a moment, you might hear something under the noise. The sound of bells that once measured time, the murmur of markets, the scratch of a quill, and the quiet insistence that ordinary lives, not just famous names, are what make history real. To go deeper, let's slow down and place ourselves inside 3 rooms that explain the medieval world better than any single statistic. The first room is a peasant house on a manor. The second is a town workshop. The third is a parish church where the living negotiate with the dead. The peasant house is smaller than many modern bedrooms. The walls might be wattle and daub, a woven lattice packed with clay, or rough stone in some regions. The roof might be thatch, thick enough to keep out rain if it is well maintained, but always vulnerable to fire. The center of the home is the hearth. Smoke does not politely rise into a chimney. It hangs and drifts, escaping through vents and gaps. Over years, it blackens beams and lungs alike. The floor is packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes. Clothing is functional and mended until it can be mended no more. Possessions are few because every object has a cost. A cooking pot is valuable. A knife is valuable. A blanket is valuable. A cow is a family savings account that also breathes. The day's work is partly predictable and partly not. Predictable because the seasons insist. Unpredictable because weather is a master without mercy. In spring, fields are prepared and seed is sown with a kind of hope that is also a wager. In summer, weeds are fought and animals are watched. In autumn, the harvest arrives like a deadline you cannot miss. In winter, work shifts to maintenance and survival. Repairing tools, tending animals, making sure the stored grain lasts, and enduring the cold. The medieval year is not divided into work and life. Work is life, and the exceptions are feast days. In many places, the land is shared in a pattern that looks chaotic to modern eyes. Long, narrow strips scattered across the open fields. This is not an accident, it is a way of distributing risk. If one part of the field floods, another might survive. If soil varies, each household receives a mix. Communal agriculture is also communal negotiation. When do we plow? When do we turn animals onto stubble to graze? When do we close the common meadow for hay? These decisions are practical, but they are also political, because they reveal who has influence and who does not. A plow team requires animals, often oxen, and oxen require feed. Not everyone owns enough animals. Households cooperate or rent animals, and debts form. Work creates obligation, obligation creates dependence. Dependence becomes a social structure, and above the village stands the manor. The Lord's house might be a stone manor hall or a fortified residence, or it might be less imposing depending on time and place. But the authority is there. A manor is not only land, it is a legal machine. The Lord claims rights, the right to hold court, the right to demand certain labor services, the right to take fees for the mill, the oven, the press. The villagers have customs too, rights remembered and defended by repetition. Custom is a kind of law made from memory, but custom can be manipulated. Records can be rewritten. This is how we have always done it, becomes both a shield and a weapon. For serfs, the weight is heavier. A serf's relationship to land is binding. You work your strips, but you owe labor on the Lord's demesnes. You cannot always marry or move freely without payment or permission. You inherit obligations with the holding. That is why historical definitions emphasize the bond to the plot of land. The person is not sold like a piece of furniture, but the person's life is still tethered. The difference from slavery can matter in legal theory, and it matters in the fact that serfs can have families, property, and recognized rights. But in the texture of daily life, dependency still feels like dependency. Now imagine the second room, a town workshop. Here, the air is sharper, full of specific smells. If it is a dyer's shop, the smell is chemical and sour. If it is a tanner's yard, the smell is powerful enough to make visitors step back. If it is a baker's shop, the smell is warm and comforting, and customers line up early. If it is a metalworker's space, you hear hammering, bellows, and the sudden violent music of iron. Every craft has its own rhythm. A medieval town is not merely a place of commerce, it is a place of status. Townspeople fight for charters, for the right to govern themselves, for the right to hold markets, for the right to tax and police. The medieval city is often a political invention created by negotiation with a king or a lord. Walls matter because walls define who belongs and who does not. Gates matter because they control flow. The town lives by controlling movement. Movement of goods, movement of people, movement of information. Guilds sit at the center of this. The guild is a club, a school, an insurance network, a moral community, and sometimes a cartel. It trains apprentices, sets standards, and punishes those who break rules. It organizes religious life by maintaining altars and sponsoring processions. It organizes social life with feasts and ceremonies. It organizes political life by influencing councils and elections, and it organizes memory by burying members with honor. If you are an apprentice, your life is not your own in the modern sense. You live in your master's household. You eat what the household eats. You are disciplined by the household's rules. You work long hours. You learn craft, but you also learn obedience and reputation. An apprentice who runs away does not simply lose a job, he becomes suspect. A master who abuses an apprentice risks fines and community anger, but the balance of power is still uneven. When an apprentice becomes a journeyman, the world opens slightly. Journeymen can travel, they can earn wages, they can take their skills to another town. Travel spreads knowledge, it also spreads disease. Medieval mobility is a paradox. The world feels local for many peasants, but it is surprisingly connected for those tied to trade, pilgrimage, or craft. Now look at the market street. Medieval towns regulate food because hunger becomes unrest. Bread is life. In many places, there are official measures and inspections. A baker who cheats can be punished publicly. Ale is also life. It is safer than many water sources, and it is calories in liquid form. Women are often involved in brewing in household contexts, and in some towns, alewives become a recognizable social figure. They can be respected, but they can also be mocked or targeted by authorities. Again, agency and vulnerability overlap. Town life is dense, and density brings risk. Fire is one of the greatest threats. Streets are narrow, buildings are close, roofs are thatched. A single spark can become a disaster. Towns enforce rules, keep ovens safe, keep certain crafts away from wooden structures, keep water ready. Night watches exist, but the fear remains. Disease also thrives in density. Medieval people do not know about bacteria, but they know patterns. They know that filth, bad air, crowded spaces, and certain seasons correlate with sickness. They build hospitals, often attached to religious institutions. These hospitals are not modern clinics. They are places of care, shelter, and spiritual preparation. Lepers are often segregated. Plague victims are sometimes isolated as best as people can manage, though the tools are limited. Quarantine practices develop in some maritime contexts over time. People watch what happens, and they adapt. Now the third room, the parish church. Here, medieval life makes its deepest promises. The church is not only about belief, it is about belonging. In a village, the church marks the center of community. It holds baptisms, marriages, funerals. It holds feast day rituals. It holds confession. It holds the memory of the dead. It is where people argue about tithes and seating and repairs. It is where the priest can become a local power and where villagers can resent him and still need him. In towns, churches multiply. Parish churches, monasteries, friaries, chapels, each with its own role. The medieval church teaches that death is not the end, but the transition. It teaches that the soul can be helped by prayers, masses, and the intercession of saints. This is not only theology, it becomes economics. People pay for masses. They endow chantries. They donate candles and land. They join confraternities that promise prayers after death. The living invest in the afterlife like a kind of spiritual insurance. This belief in purgatory, in a realm where souls are purified, intensifies the importance of memory. To be forgotten is frightening, because it means fewer prayers. So people build systems to keep names alive. Wills are practical documents and spiritual documents at once. A will distributes goods and distributes obligations. I leave money for the repair of the bridge. I leave candles for the altar. I leave coins to the poor. I leave funds for masses for my soul. A good death includes settling accounts. And what is a good death in medieval terms? It is not dying without pain. Many deaths are painful. It is dying with preparation, confessed, absolved, reconciled, surrounded by community, with last rites. Manuals appear that teach people how to die well, how to face temptation and fear at the end. This does not eliminate terror. It gives terror a script. Now, marriage sits inside this religious framework. The church insists that marriage is sacramental. It also insists, as we said, that consent matters. That creates tensions. Families want control. Individuals want choice. The church wants order and legitimacy. The result is a complex legal landscape. Consider the practice of bans, public announcements of intended marriage, meant to prevent clandestine unions and to reveal impediments, existing marriages, close kinship, coercion. But clandestine marriages still happen. Lovers speak vows in private. Families push matches that children resist. Cases appear in church courts where someone claims they were promised marriage and then abandoned. Words matter. Witnesses matter. He took my hand and called me wife becomes a legal argument. Marriage can also be a site of violence. Domestic abuse exists. The church condemns excessive cruelty, but enforcement is uneven. Separation is possible in some circumstances, but divorce in the modern sense is not. Annulment exists for certain reasons: coercion, impotence, prior marriage, close kinship. These legal categories can be used strategically by powerful people. The personal and the political blur. For women, marriage is both protection and constraint. A husband can provide security. He can also control property and movement. In many regions, women's legal status changes at marriage, but women are not simply powerless. They can own property in some contexts, especially as widows. They can inherit, they can litigate, they can manage households. In towns, they can participate in trade and craft, sometimes under their own names. Widows can be economically significant, which is why remarriage becomes a contested issue. Family members and guild members may want to control a widow's assets, while she may want to choose her future. Clothing, too, becomes a language of status. Sumptuary laws, where they exist, attempt to regulate what classes can wear, not because authorities care about fashion, but because they care about visible hierarchy. Cloth is expensive, dye is expensive, fur is expensive, silk is expensive. To wear above your station is to challenge the social order. So clothing becomes politics, stitched into daily life. Food is politics as well. In noble life, feasts display power. Spices and imported goods signal wealth and connection. In peasant life, bread quality signals the year's fortune. In famine, the diet shifts. More legumes, more weeds, more desperation. In extreme hunger, social taboos erode. People steal, people migrate, people revolt. Authorities respond with punishment or with limited relief. The medieval world can be remarkably resilient, but it is not infinitely so. Now return to the Black Death with this social architecture in mind, and you can feel why it hits like an earthquake. It does not only kill individuals, it breaks routines, contracts, obligations, and expectations. A lord expects labor services, but laborers are dead. A guild expects apprentices, but households are empty. A priest expects to administer last rites, but he is sick. A family expects an inheritance line, but the heirs have been buried. The plague is not just a medical event. It is a legal and economic event, a spiritual event, a psychological event. In England, for example, after the first waves of plague, authorities attempt to control wages and labor mobility because workers have more bargaining power and landlords panic. The very attempt to freeze the old order reveals that the old order has shifted. In some regions, serfdom weakens over time because it becomes harder to enforce binding obligations when people can flee and be welcomed elsewhere. In other regions, landlords tighten control. Again, it is patchwork. There is no single outcome, but there is a common lesson. When death changes the balance of labor, society must renegotiate. Religiously, the plague produces both renewed devotion and bitter skepticism. Some people see it as divine punishment. Others see it as evidence that holiness does not guarantee safety. Flagellant movements rise in some places, with people whipping themselves in public as acts of penance. Scapegoating rises too, with minorities accused of causing the disease. Fear looks for an explanation, and when explanations are weak, blame becomes a substitute. This is one of the darkest patterns in human history, and the medieval period is not exempt. Yet within all this, people still marry. They still baptize babies. They still rebuild houses. They still celebrate festivals when they can. The medieval world is not defined only by catastrophe. It is defined by continuity in the face of catastrophe. Think about children again. In a world where many do not survive infancy, childhood becomes both cherished and precarious. Parents invest love and labor into children, but they also face repeated grief. Baptism happens quickly because the salvation of the soul matters, and because death in the early weeks is common. Godparents become important as social ties. Orphans exist in large numbers, especially after plague years. Communities absorb them, exploit them, or protect them, depending on circumstance. Charity is a Christian duty, but charity is also a social negotiation. Education exists too, though not evenly. Clerical education is more common because reading and writing are tools of administration and liturgy. Some towns develop schools. Universities emerge. Literacy grows slowly. Most people remain illiterate, but they live in a world saturated with oral culture. Sermons, stories, songs, public readings, and visual literacy through stained glass and painted walls. People learn the Bible through images and through hearing, not only through reading. The medieval mind is not empty because it lacks print. It is full because it is trained by repetition and performance. And then there is law, which is sometimes brutal and sometimes surprisingly procedural. Manor courts handle local disputes, land boundaries, unpaid dues, broken fences, minor violence, communal obligations. Town courts handle trade disputes and civic order. Church courts handle marriage, morals, and wills. Royal courts handle larger crimes and property conflicts. To modern eyes, medieval justice can look arbitrary, but it also shows a deep concern with public order and precedent. The growth of record-keeping, charters, and bureaucratic habit is one of the quiet revolutions of medieval Europe. This matters because it changes how people think about themselves. A person becomes a named party in a document. A dispute becomes a written record. A marriage becomes a legal fact. The medieval period is, among other things, an era where paper, parchment, seals, and archives begin to shape power. When you see the Abbey's records, you are seeing the bureaucratic side of memory, the administrative spine under the poetic surface. Now, let's step out of England for a moment, because the medieval world is wider than one island. Pilgrimage routes cross Europe, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, to local shrines. Merchants travel from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The Hanseatic League links northern ports. Crusades connect European violence with Eastern Mediterranean politics. Islamic scholars preserve and expand scientific knowledge. Jewish communities navigate precarious positions in Christian lands. The Byzantine world carries Roman legacy in another direction. Medieval life is interconnected even when it feels locally rooted. But the heart of our story remains the everyday. A woman stirring pottage, a man sharpening a sickle, a child carrying a bundle of sticks, a journeyman rolling cloth, a widow counting coins, a priest preparing the altar, a bell ringing, a cart rattling over stone. Now, because our title thread is Life, Death, and Marriage, let's tighten the braid. Medieval people marry partly to live. They have children partly to survive. They bury the dead partly to preserve community. Each element supports the others. Marriage provides labor and legitimacy. It organizes property and inheritance. It creates networks of obligation. A marriage connects two households, which means it connects two sets of neighbors, two sets of kin, two sets of responsibilities. When conflict arises between spouses, it becomes a community issue. When a husband drinks too much or squanders resources, the household suffers and neighbors notice. When a wife is accused of infidelity, honor and legitimacy become public concerns. Gossip is not merely entertainment, it is social regulation. Death interrupts all of this, and therefore death rituals become important. Wakes bring people together. Funerals mark status. Who attends, who carries the bier, what prayers are said, where the body is placed. In some contexts, the wealthy can buy burial inside the church, closer to the sacred, while the poor rest outside. Over time, churches become crowded with burials and the living walk on the dead. The smell of death is part of the religious environment. Medieval Christianity teaches that bodies will rise again. Therefore, bodies matter even in decay. Relics matter. Tombs matter. The body is not a disposable shell. Grief is shaped by theology. A parent mourning a child may cling to the idea of heaven. A widow may fear purgatory for her husband, and therefore pay for masses. A person approaching death may fear demons and temptation, and therefore summon a priest. The church offers a narrative that can comfort, but it can also intensify anxiety because it places stakes on every moment. Did you confess properly? Did you have time? Did you die suddenly? Did you have unresolved sins? This fear of sudden death is one reason why medieval people value preparation. They make pilgrimages, they participate in confraternities, they practice charity, they hope to die at home, surrounded by community, with time for rites. A sudden death in an accident or a battle can feel spiritually terrifying because it deprives the person of ritual closure. That is why saints who protect travelers, sailors, and pregnant women are popular. Protection is a spiritual marketplace, and ordinary people participate in it because they are surrounded by risks they cannot control. So, when you stand in Westminster Abbey and read names, remember that behind every carved letter is a set of fears and hopes that once had a pulse. Chaucer's pilgrims traveled to Canterbury to honor St. Thomas Becket, a martyr whose story is itself about power, violence, and sanctity. Pilgrimage is not merely tourism, it is penance, prayer, social networking, and storytelling all at once. On the road, people share tales, trade rumors, argue about morality, and reveal their social tensions. The road becomes a temporary society, a moving town without walls. That is why it makes such a powerful frame for imagining medieval life. Movement forces people together. Now, we should also acknowledge what the medieval period contains that is hard to sit with. Punishment can be harsh. Hierarchies can be rigid. Violence can be normalized. Women can be constrained and exploited. Religious intolerance can be brutal. Poverty can be relentless. But if we only list these as moral verdicts, we miss what is historically useful. Understanding how people navigated their world with the tools available and how those tools shaped later societies. The medieval period is often treated as a bridge between Rome and the Renaissance, as if it exists only to connect two things modern people like. That is unfair. The medieval world is a creator, not merely a carrier. It creates universities, legal traditions, town governments, parliaments, guild systems, vernacular literature, and architectural achievements that still dominate skylines. It also creates patterns of exclusion and conflict that still echo. It is an ancestor in both senses, inspiring and troubling. Now, to make this personal, imagine three individuals. First, a young man on a manor who has just inherited his father's strips. He is not rich, he is not free in the modern sense, but he is not powerless. He knows the customs, he knows the boundaries of the field by memory. He knows which neighbors can be trusted. He knows the steward's moods. He hopes for a good harvest and a good marriage. And we listen, carefully, still. And maybe that is the final lesson of medieval life, death, and marriage. The past is not one mood, and it is not one myth. It is a chain of mornings, meals, bargains, vows, births, fevers, prayers, jokes, quarrels, and goodbyes. When we stand in a building made to remember, we are not only honoring the famous, we are meeting the countless people who left no monuments. The farmers and midwives, the apprentices and widows, the children who lived only a season. Listen under the traffic and you can almost hear their world. The distance shrinks, it becomes human. In that recognition, history feels quietly alive. That is why we walked here.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments